Hello, my name is Ashwin Kanhere, and I work with Professor Grace Gao in the Navigation and Autonomous Vehicles Lab at Stanford University. I'm going to talk to you about our work on improving GNSS positioning using neural network-based corrections. As many of you must be aware, deep neural networks have gained an increasing prominence in the last decade or so and are seen as promising alternatives to analytical methods. This is in part to their nature as universal function approximators. Any function can be approximated by a deep neural network given it has enough parameters. This is used to model complex input-output relationships at times better than analytical methods in domains like image classification and curve fitting. Deep neural networks also make no assumptions about the domain itself or the inputs or outputs, and as a result can approximate multimodal error sources better than many analytical methods. However, they require large quantities of labeled data to learn this input-output mapping. Given that deep neural networks are particularly effective at approximating multimodal error sources, we see an opportunity to use DNNs, deep neural networks, in GNSS positioning. GNSS positioning, as you might know, especially in urban and semi-urban areas, has many multimodal errors. These might be non-line of sight signals or multipath signals or even signal attenuation. On the right is curves fitted to the plot of residuals. As you can see in suburban conditions, this particular example, based on real-world data, has two main modes. This problem becomes more exaggerated when you have urban conditions, where not only do you have two main modes, you also have a significantly heavy tail. Now, if you were to approximate these distributions as Gaussian distributions, as classic approaches tend to do, the difference between the true error model and the approximated error model is going to result in positioning accuracy being reduced. Given that we have multimodal errors and a complex relationship between these errors and the output's positions, why not use DNNs for GNSS? As we know, they model the input-output map between multimodal and nonlinear sources pretty well. And with the increasing amount of publicly available labeled data with ground truth positions, we can actually train deep neural networks when we want to. However, this isn't as easy as taking the measurements and the position solution, putting them on either end and running gradient descent to let the neural network train itself, which is why so far DNNs for GNSS positioning have been limited to the measurement domain. When you move from the measurement domain to the positioning domain, you run into a few challenges. In particular, the fact that inputs to GNSS positioning algorithms are set value. What I mean when I say that they're set value is that they can vary in number and order over time. You need to be able to give a positioning solution irrespective of whether you have 4 satellites or 5 satellites. And irrespective of the number, if you were to change their order, the output should not change. This is a challenge because common DNNs are designed to handle a fixed input size, and the order of the inputs also affects the outputs. Another challenge is the fact that you have poorly conditioned measurements. So satellite positions and pseudo ranges are not numerically well conditioned with respect to each other. Satellite ECF coordinates can vary from minus 20,200 kilometers to plus 20,200 kilometers along all 3 ECF axes. Every bit of variation is significant here. However, for pseudo ranges, the values are along the same order, 20,200 kilometers, but variations of about 100 meters are significant and impact the position solution. This is a problem because common DNNs require the inputs to have a similar magnitude for numerical stable training. In addition to these challenges that are specific to the GNSS positioning domain, you run the problem of overfitting, which happens whenever you use a DNN with a limited data set. Now, the data set might be limited in fact that the ground truth is not widely available, so you don't have a lot of samples, or there's insufficient diversity between the ground truth you have. In this case, the neural network might memorize a data-specific input-output mapping. In this case, for example, the neural network for image classification is trained only on images of upright dogs. So when it sees an upside-down dog, it may think airplane. But we know that's not the case. This is just a dog with very fluffy ears. Now, in this case, the problem is solved by increasing the number of samples available to the neural network. You train the neural network on images of upright dogs as well as upside-down dogs, in which case it sees this dog and recognizes that it's in fact a dog and not an airplane. This technique is called data augmentation and is also applicable to our area of concern. Say the ground truth data you're working on is all collected from the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, if you were to pick a test point from this area, you would get a position estimate in this area. After all, this is something the neural network has seen before. But if you were to pick a test point that it hasn't seen before, say something from the eastern coast of the United States, the neural network might still think that the position estimate is in the same region as the ground truth location. This is because the neural network has done things it should not have. It has memorized the input position pair. So it always gives you an estimate within this region where the ground truth was collected and has not learned the functional mapping. In order to facilitate learning the functional mapping, we need data augmentation in this area to prevent overfitting to specific geographic region. Keeping in mind these challenges, our contributions are to design a deep neural network in the position domain. We do so by changing the problem of estimating positions to that of estimating position corrections to a supplied reference position. For scaling and global applicability, we use well-conditioned input features. To prevent overfitting, we develop a geometry-based data augmentation method. We validate our approach on real-world data using the Android raw GNSS measurements dataset, as almost everyone in this session. Our implementation is publicly available on our lab's GitHub page. And to our knowledge, this is the first data-driven method in the GNSS positioning domain. The rest of this presentation has two main parts. First, I'm going to get down into more details about our approach, namely the data conditioning, the geometry-based data augmentation, and our neural network architecture. And I'm going to follow this up by giving you some details about how we perform the experimental validation. So onwards and forwards to our proposed approach. We start by taking a random initial guess in the vicinity of the ground truth. Using this random initial guess and the true collected measurements, the pseudo ranges and satellite positions, we perform data conditioning to generate local measurements, LOS vectors and residuals. These measurements go into the neural network, which outputs a correction in the northeast down directions. This correction is added to the random initial guess to get you a new position estimate. Talking about data conditioning, we perform data conditioning to enable numerically stable training. We leverage the fact that we've assumed the initial guess is in the same vicinity as the ground truth to create a local frame of reference at the initial guess. Using this local frame of reference, we convert the satellite ECF positions to LOS vectors. LOS vectors are normalized. They have unit magnitude always. So their variation is now just between -1 and 1 along all axes. We convert the pseudo ranges to residuals. The advantage of using residuals is since the guess is in the same vicinity as the true position, the variation along the residuals is around 100 meters or so, and that is the same variation that is impactful to the final position solution. The outputs are also local position corrections. Instead of ECEF position corrections, these corrections are in the NED frame. Again, depend on the local frame of reference that you've spawned at the initial position. By abstracting the neural network out of the global position estimation problem and giving it local inputs to have it output local values, we make sure that this particular approach is applicable for any initial guess worldwide. If the measurements, pseudo-range residuals and LOS vectors are the same as is the true position and initial guess, no matter where you are, be it San Francisco or Australia, you'll get the same correction. This leads to global applicability of our approach. To prevent overfitting, we use geometry-based data augmentation. So for geometry-based data augmentation, we take the true position we have and randomly perturb it to get the initial guess. The perturbation changes at every guess. This allows the neural network to see a set of inputs and the corresponding output, which forces the network to learn the geometric aspect of the input-output mapping. It does not memorize a particular set of inputs to a particular set of outputs, but learns the functional mapping between the two. This prevents overfitting and improves generalization to unseen input-output pairs. Because let's face it, these are continuous domains, both on the input and the output, so the neural network cannot feasibly see all possible cases. Now, getting down to the architecture. Over on the left is a pictorial representation of what the vectors look like as they go through different layers of the neural network. Here in the middle, we have the neural network architecture itself. The input to the neural network is the residual and LOS vectors concatenated together for each satellite. So if you have M satellites, you have an M by 4 matrix that goes in. Now, M can vary between different training and measurement epochs because this architecture is in fact number invariant. The linear fully connected layers scale and shift the input to the domain of the transformer encoder inputs and the output of the decoder into NED corrections. One thing to note here is D, which is the latent vector length, which is a design parameter. In our case, we choose D to be 64. D is essentially the higher dimension in which the neural network is going to project these inputs so that it can extract useful and relevant information out and use it to find NED corrections. The main component of our network is the set transformer, which consists of the encoder, pooling, and decoder layers. The encoder takes the scaled and shifted features and further encodes them into a different set of vectors. Now, one thing to note here is that the linear FC layers and the transformer encoder all operate on a vector-to-vector basis. Until the pooling layer, vectors for different satellites do not interact with each other. The pooling layer combines all these vectors and is the part that gives us number and order invariance. A little bit more about this in the next slide. And creates a pooled feature. Now, this pooled feature has information for the corrections, which is decoded and then changed by the linear FC layers to get the NED correction. The NED correction is compared to the truth using a mean square error loss function. And the aim of the training strategy is to reduce this loss on the entire training data set. Now let's talk a little bit more about our main component, which is the set transformer. In particular, let's talk about how the transformer pooling layer provides number and order invariance. As shown by this picture over here, you have encoded features, which came out of the encoder. There's M of these, again, M can vary. And they're all of length D. D for this case is fixed. What the transformer pooling layer does is it combines all these latent vectors for all satellites into a single vector. Now, by design of the pooling architecture, which is from the original paper on set transformers, different inputs can have different number of satellites because this particular block doesn't have a fixed requirement on what M should be. Additionally, the order of the encoded features does not change the output. So this gives our entire architecture number and order invariance. One thing to look at in particular is that the set transformer jointly learns encoding, pooling, and decoding. So what happens is in end-to-end training, because there's no model being used and everything is trained together in one single go, what the network does is learns a latent vector representation in the encoding, learns a pooling process and a decoding process that aids the finding of position corrections. So what you can think of intuitively is the encoder further encodes the high dimensional features that we have from the FC layers, and pooling combines all of this information into the information necessary to find the NED corrections. Now, since this is in a higher dimension, this has to go through a decoder and has to be scaled and shifted again, but the information to find NED corrections has been obtained here. Having talked about how we perform data conditioning, data augmentation, and our neural network architecture, let's talk a little bit about the experimental validation. In particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the parameters of our experiment, show you some trajectory plots, some qualitative traces that we thought were interesting, and the results warranted a little bit more discussion. And in the end, I'm going to talk about error statistics over the entire test data set. So like almost everyone in this session, we use the Android raw GNSS measurements dataset for training and evaluation. We limited ourselves to the training traces in particular because they have an associated ground truth with them, which makes it easier for us to train the neural network and evaluate its performance against a baseline. There's about 35.5 hours of training data with ground truth position fixes in these training traces that we split 70% into a set for training that is used to train the neural network, 10% for validation that we use to ensure that the neural network is actually learning what it is supposed to and its performance is improving as training progresses, and 20% for evaluation. Now, the split for evaluation is not seen by the network during training. We do not observe the network's performance on it in validation. So this is completely new for the network, and it's evaluated only after it has been trained. We use weighted least squares as a baseline using elevation-based weights. As weighted least squares is a snapshot-based approach, this approach tallies very closely to our proposed approach and uses the same amount of information that we're giving the network, making it an appropriate baseline to use. Now, if you remember from when I was talking about the proposed approach, the initial point is selected randomly. And this is in fact a hyperparameter. The amount of randomness affects what the neural network learns and how it performs, as you will see in the upcoming slides. But I wanted to stress that the initial randomness is in fact a hyperparameter here. One result of note was the performance on a semi-urban trace. The neural network was trained on many such semi-urban traces. And it is data that the neural network has seen during training. Not this exact trace, but it has seen data similar to this. As expected here, with the random initialization of 15 meters, we have an RMSE of close to 15 meters. WLS performs quite well here with an RMSE of roughly 10 meters. And our approach reduces the random initial error to roughly half of its value. Our approach outperforms WLS over here and does as we would expect. The results become more interesting when we move to an urban trace. Now, this kind of data is not something that the network was actually exposed to during the training process. During the training process, most of the traces were semi-urban traces, and this is somewhat different from what the network has seen. We evaluate randomness, weighted least squares, and our approach in two metrics. We have the root mean square error in the horizontal direction, north and east, and the root mean square error in the NV direction. Now, for the random initialization, the errors are as to be expected. In the horizontal direction, everything has performed similar to how it performed in the semi-urban case, where WLS has an RMSE of around 12.88 meters, and our approach roughly halves the error in the initial randomness. What's interesting to see here, though, is once we start looking at the RMSE in all three axes, so we've added the down axis in this horizontal dimension, randomness gets degraded to around what it's expected. We expect an RMSE of about 20 meters in this case. WLS, however, gets degraded significantly. Its performance is now worse than the random initialization, whereas our approach isn't as impacted. This shows that our approach is outperforming WLS significantly well in the vertical direction. This is also borne out in a comparison over the entire evaluation dataset. For this case, we are not comparing the RMSE, we are comparing the absolute errors. And what you see are three box plots of the absolute error in the north direction, east dimension, and down dimension. We are comparing weighted least squares with two different networks, each of which is trained with different initial randomness. The one in orange over here is trained with 15 meters of initial randomness in the northeast and down directions. The one in green over here is trained with 30 meters of initial randomness in the northeast and down directions. One thing that is clear from these graphs is that the performance depends on the magnitude of the initial randomness. In particular, the network with less initial randomness almost seems to match WLS in the north and east directions, whereas the other network with more initial randomness is outperformed by both of these approaches. An interesting thing to note here is that the network actually learns the magnitude of the largest corrections. If you have a network trained on 15 meters of initial randomness, the correction is never going to be larger than 30 meters in any direction, which is why the absolute error here is constrained by 30 meters in all three cases, because the network has learned the greatest data that it has to provide in this case, which is an interesting piece of additional information that WLS does not have access to, which also explains why networks with smaller initial randomness are outperforming networks with larger initial randomness. An interesting thing to note here, though, is that both networks with 15 meters initial randomness and 30 meters initial randomness outperform WLS in the vertical direction. Now, the network in green over here with 30 meters of initial randomness was outperformed by WLS in north and east, but outperforms WLS in the vertical direction. This indicates that this is actually a direction of great promise. So to conclude, in this work, we proposed a neural network that estimates corrections to random initial guesses. We provided a method of data conditioning for local numerically scaled inputs to the network. We developed a method of geometry-based data augmentation to prevent overfitting and improve generalization. And our neural network architecture is invariant to the number and order of inputs. As you saw in the last few slides, the horizontal performance of our approach depends on initial randomness, but our approach outperforms WLS in the vertical direction significantly well. This work is just in its beginning stages, and in the future, we plan to extend to sequence of measurements and include other measurements such as Doppler shift frequencies. As I mentioned before, our implementation is publicly available on our GitHub page and can be accessed using this QR code to the right. I would like to thank Adam Dye, Tara Meena, and Sriramya Bhamidipati, and all members of the NAV Lab for their help and insightful discussions. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you have a good day.